Winemaking 101.
So, what is wine, anyway? I mean, we've all heard of wine, obviously. But wine is an alcoholic beverage made from the fermentation of fruits or sugars where yeast act on these sugars to produce ethanol, carbon dioxide, and thousands of other compounds in trace amounts. By the way, this is a brew talk. We haven't done one of these in a while, and it was about time. And there's a lot of questions about wine, and, well, we're starting to get into wine a little bit more, and we thought, why not?
So we're going to be reviewing the basics, the very minimal principles and equipment required to make wine at home.
By the way, if you're interested in mead, all of these things still apply. More on that in a bit. Wine is traditionally known to be made from grapes. And yes, I'm going to be reading from notes because there's a lot of information here. So pardon me if I'm looking down and looking up and looking down and looking up. But anyway, you can also make wine from nearly any fruit: rice, grains, sugar, maple syrup, and even honey, which is called mead. See, I mentioned that a little bit ago. The labels are mostly legal and governmental in usage, and some people might argue that wine made from anything other than grapes is not wine. We are not some people. My take on it is this. Wine as a commodity is from grapes, okay? But wine is something you make at home to drink as a beverage with a meal, or just, to have an alcoholic beverage. We're all allowed to do that as long as you're of legal age in your country or territory. But it's something that everybody made in the home. It shouldn't be anything super labeled, okay? So if you have apples in your backyard and you want to make apple wine, it's apple wine, right? If you have mulberries, blackberries, strawberries, whatever, you
Pomegranate.
Pomegranate. You can totally make a wine from that. There's no issue. If you have your own honey, technically you're still making wine. They don't call mead honey wine for nothing. I mean, the process is much the same, okay? Some people will say the cider versus wine controversy. Okay, cider is, again, it's like always made from apples or pears. Well, yeah, I guess, sort of. But again, that's a label that doesn't mean a whole lot in actual functionality and usage. It's not like the wine police are going to come to your house and arrest you because you called a cider a wine or vice versa, okay? So I generally distinguish it as if it's below, like, say, 7% or 6%, it's probably a cider. And if it's above that, it's a wine. Simple, okay? You can make wine from whole fruit, juiced fruit, cooked down syrups, and fruit from store-bought juices, so long as there's no preservatives. We get people saying this a lot. I made a wine, like they don't think it's wine, or they're calling it Pruno if they're using a store-bought juice. Well, here's the thing. Big wineries, commercial wineries, take whole fruit and they juice it and then they make wine from it. So you're just skipping the middleman, and in most cases it's easier, quicker, and you usually can get a better product that way because the juices you buy will probably be a little bit better than if you bought, say, table grapes from the grocery store and try to make wine from it.
An anecdotal side note is the difference between white wines and red wines when we're talking about grape wines. White wines tend to be juiced first. That means they extract the juice from the pulp and the seeds, and they ferment that. While red wines tend to have the seeds and the pulp and the skins remaining intact while they start fermentation, and then they will juice it.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to think that the difference between red wine and white wine is actually the grape color. It's got nothing to do with it. Almost all wine is made from a red colored grape because they're the sweeter ones. They actually have a higher sugar concentration. And most wine grapes are small. Table grapes, while they may taste sweet, don't actually have the same sugar concentration and won't have the same flavor characteristics when you ferment them. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means they might not taste the same. Okay, backyard grapes and things like that, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, we get muscadines in Florida. We have a grape in our backyard, Lambrusco, a variety of Lambrusco. Makes great wine, but not necessarily something that you would find a wine made from, which sounds really odd. But that's the beauty of wines. A lot of the wines are made with a specific variety of grape because either it grew really well in an area where it's from, so it made it very economical. Because in the beginning, mead was more important. Wine only became bigger when grapes and sugar became cheaper than honey.
And since we're on that side topic, I will continue a little bit further before we get back to the meat of our video and talk about the different types of wine that you may find in the store, like Chardonnay,
Pinot Noir.
I always say it wrong.
Cabernet, Cabernet Sauvignon. There's a million of them.
Champagne, etc. These things are named based primarily not only on the grapes that they're made from, but the region that those grapes are
Mhm.
grown.
Yep,
Those grapes are grown.
like champagne.
Yes,
It's
Be-
sparkling wine everywhere else.
because the what is it,
Terroir.
terroir, which is a fancy Italian or French.
French.
See, I don't even know. It means the dirt. It's
Yeah.
like where they are grown. The actual elements that are in the dirt evoke a certain flavor profile in those grapes, and that's why that particular region makes that particular type of wine.
Yeah, to go into that a little further, there was grapes that were grown in France. I forget which variety it was. They were grown in France, and some people brought those to California to make the same kind of wine, and they found that the wines tasted completely different. But as a result, the California growers basically made their own versions of a lot of these things, and California wines are some of the finest wines in the world, right up there with the French wines and Italian wines and Spanish wines.
Yep.
Just different.
But I just wanted to touch on that really quickly because we do get lots of requests. Could you make a Chardonnay? We could attempt to make a Chardonnay-like product, but it won't actually be Chardonnay because we're not in that region and don't have access to that particular grape strain.
Yep, exactly. Safety. Safety is very important, okay? And it's so important that we actually did a video on it. But I want to talk about that for a minute. A lot of people are totally freaked out that they're going to get sick or poison themselves or hurt people by making wine at home. Making wine at home is no more or less safe than cooking at home. Let me say that again. Making your own wine at home is no more or less safe than cooking at home. You can poison somebody just as easily by cooking as you can by winemaking. Now, that's not to say it's easy to do. You actually have to mess up pretty badly. And actually, I would venture to say it's easier to poison someone by cooking than it is by making wine. And
I would think so too.
And here's why. In order to mess up a wine so bad that you would get sick from it, you have to make huge mistakes that are against common sense. And you have to willingly drink something that smells and tastes so vile as to make you retch bringing it to your mouth. So if you do that and you get sick, I have to question a few more things than your ability to make wine. That just goes along with it. But that's just to make you sick. And at worst, you're probably just going to throw up. Like your body will eject it from itself. As far as actually harming someone with it, not likely. Not very likely at all. Unless you put harmful things into it, like put kerosene into your wine, and it's probably going to make someone very ill. But would you drink kerosene normally? No. So why would you put it in your wine? You probably wouldn't cook with it either, right? Same idea. So, if you wanted to make your own homemade wine, what do you need? Well, there's pretty basic equipment that you need. We're going to go through some of that right now. Things you will need to make homemade wine. The first thing you want to consider is sanitation. Okay, you want to be clean as you can be. Put simply, sanitation is probably the most major concern in homebrew, all right? But you don't have to go completely nuts with sanitation. Just be clean enough, okay? Let me explain. You're depending on millions of microscopic organisms to spoil a sugary liquid the way you want them to. Technically, wine is a spoiled product of that thing. Fermentation is the spoiling process. It's a putrefaction process, believe it or not. There's a few ways this can go sideways on you, and one of them is an infection by an organism you didn't want in the first place. There's lots of bacteria and lots of things that can get into a brew that want to get in there, or that you can activate that are already there that you want to keep to a minimum, okay? By using a sanitizer, like Star San, this stuff, Star San is actually a concentrated form of a type of acid that does not harm yeast in the amounts that you would use it in. And this container here makes hundreds of gallons of Star San. It just works beautifully.
You're basically going to dilute it based on the directions included
use
with
the
Star
directions.
San.
But use like a cap full for several gallons. It's pretty easy. By using a sanitizer like Star San to clean your gear, you can reduce the chances of this happening. If you cannot get Star San or some other sanitizer where you are, boiling your gear in water will also work. Just be careful because some plastics don't like to be boiled. Do avoid, in other words, do not use vinegar or bleach, as they can both inhibit yeast if not done absolutely correctly. Now, somebody's going to tell me they use bleach all the time and it works out just fine. And you know what? If you know what you're doing and you do it right, it can work. I really wouldn't use vinegar, because vinegar is actually one of the things that you're trying to prevent when you're making homebrew wine, because there's a bacteria called acetobacter that lives in almost everything, just like yeast. And, well, under the right conditions, which means oxygen and alcohol, it can be activated and it will start turning your lovely wine into a lovely vinegar, which I did say a lovely vinegar because vinegar is a good thing too. It's just not wine. Different video. The next thing you'll need is something to ferment in, also known as a fermentation vessel. This can be food grade bucket, which is perfectly fine to use for primary fermentation, a glass jar, or even the container your juice was packaged in. Now, there's an advantage to the container your juice was packaged in, and there's a disadvantage. First, it's plastic, which is the disadvantage. I'll get to that in a second. But the advantage is it's already a sterile environment, or else it would have spoiled or turned to wine right there in the package. So all you have to do is open it up, add some yeast, and you just made wine on a very, very basic level.
You just started the process of making wine.
Well, see, there's some debate. Some people will say that that is wine once you add the yeast, even though there's really no alcohol in it yet. Okay, so she's right, but it is still considered wine. Anyway, well, I don't recommend long-term storage of wines in plastic because plastic is molecularly similar to fat, and fat leaches flavors back and forth. It's a flavor transport device. If you leave alcoholic beverages in plastic for too long, even food grade, it can start to leach plastic out and it'll taste a little plasticky, and it could be potentially not so good for you. It is fairly common, though, to do a primary fermentation, your first fermentation, in a plastic bucket and things like that, as they only generally last a few weeks. So it's not really that big of a deal. That's the end of page 1. The next thing you'll need is something to ferment. Now, this can be fruit, rice, grains, sugar, maple syrup, honey, juices, or any combination of the above. Please note, grains such as rice, wheat, barley, and rye all need more steps to actually ferment them. But the resulting beverage would still be a wine, in our opinion. Unless you do something crazily different to it, then it can become a beer. But you heard all that. You can use just about anything that has sugars in it to make wine. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be from a whole fruit source. You can juice those and use the juice. You can mash them up and use the pulp. You can buy the juice already pre-juiced. It's perfectly fine. The thing you want to avoid is preservatives in your juice when you purchase it, okay? Because preservatives will inhibit yeast growth, which is what they're made to do. So you're looking for anything, I like to call them ites and ates. Usually it's sulfites and sorbates. Potassium sorbate is a very popular preservative that's used in juice preservation, so that way it won't ferment. But you want to be careful with that. Yeast. This is where things get tricky. Now, Derek is holding a packet of a commercial wine yeast, okay? You can simply use the wild, naturally occurring yeast present on fruit, which almost all fruit, even stuff you get from the grocery store, is going to have some amount of yeast on it. Leaves, bark, everything outside has yeast all over it. It's in the air. It's everywhere. Some juices actually have it. We had a cranberry juice that we bought that actually fermented just by opening it. The results can be unpredictable, but it's often a fun experiment. Now, when I say unpredictable, the alcohol levels and flavors may vary wildly from batch to batch, but using the same source over and over again might actually help keep that more controlled. What I mean by that is if you know of a certain orchard that you get your apples from every single year, you're probably going to get a much more efficient and controlled thing than if you bought from this guy, then this guy, then this guy, have them shipped from across the country. Different yeasts do different things, and no two yeasts are going to be the same, and the strains will change. Just genetic mutation. It happens all the time. Things are constantly evolving.
That said, if you are brand new to winemaking and you want to give it a go, we highly suggest you use a commercial yeast for your first time because you won't have those variables to perhaps mess you up.
Yeah. You can use a commercial yeast for fermentation as well, like she's talking about. Everything from bread yeast, ale yeast, wine yeast, and champagne yeast can be used to make wines. Very much comes down to personal preference and your environment and location which to use and when. And this is why we always say if you're brand new at this, use known recipes. Watch somebody make it, learn from them, and use what they did. Don't change a thing. Use as much of it as closely as possible. We see a lot of people that say, oh, I used your recipe, but I doubled the sugar. How come my wine isn't working? Well, that's why, because you changed a very important factor. Or you made a sweet wine. Mine came out dry. I used a different yeast than you. Yes, you used a yeast that goes to a much higher tolerance. There's a lot to know about yeast, and that's why we're not making this all about yeast. We do actually have a video on just yeast itself. But yeast is yeast, all right? They're all Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That's the basics of it. They're just different strains. Even the wild yeast is still Saccharomyces cerevisiae. What it means is, think of it like dogs. Dogs are all canines, but they're bred to do specific things. So you have everything from like huskies and big German Shepherd dogs all the way down to like little poodles. Well, tiny. There are poodles that are
There's
small.
standard poodles and toy
Yeah,
poodles.
whatever. Toy poodles and like dachshunds and stuff like that. They're all bred to do different things, but in the end, they are all dogs. So yeast is much the same way. There's another thing about this, and some people don't like bread yeast for brewing, but in truth, it does a pretty fine job for most things. We use it for our basic mead and for our sweet red wine. Why? Because over testing and over dozens of batches of these, we've actually found that it's the best yeast for the job. There are other things we make that I wouldn't use bread yeast for, that I'll use a 71B, or I'll even use a champagne yeast or another wine yeast for. It all depends on what we're doing, and a little bit of experience goes a long way. Once you start doing it, you'll get a feel for this yeast works for this yeast works for this, and different recipes, different locations, different temperature scenarios. There's so many factors. Something to remember, though, is yeast can't read. They don't know what you're putting them in. So something that I like to say is there's no more wine in wine yeast than there is bread in bread yeast. Therefore, yes, you can make bread with wine yeast, and you can make wine with bread yeast, and they will both work. The question is how well and to what taste. Okay, I can make two different wines. One of them will taste great with bread yeast, the other one won't. And vice versa. I can make them with wine yeast, and one will taste great, the other one won't. It really comes down to personal bias and experience. Okay. Also, something to note, bread yeast can vary wildly and not be as consistent as a wine or ale yeast. There are yeasts marketed as mead yeast, sweet wine yeast, cider yeast, etc. Something to know is that you can make ale, wine, cider, or mead with any yeast, and you can make that a dry or sweet beverage with any yeast. Again, yeast can't read. They don't know what they're making. They only know what you give them. So you make a wine sweet or dry by the amount of sugars relative to the alcohol tolerance of your yeast. If that didn't make any sense at all, you need to watch the video that we did on yeast that explains that, and our ABV Brewing Basics video. Got a little stuck. The next things you're going to need is a little bit of gear. Now, these are technically not mandatory, but they are highly recommended, and I'll explain why in a minute. This is a hydrometer, a graduated cylinder, and a wine thief, or the master baster, as I like to use. A turkey baster works just fine. It's just some way to get the product out, okay? While it might be nice to think, I'm more of a hobbyist, I don't need these tools, I don't care what my ABV is. Well, that's a nice way to think. However, the truth is, it's more about knowing when your brew is safe to bottle, so you don't get the dreaded bottle bomb when pressure builds up due to fermentation not being complete and the bottles literally explode. There's nothing more dangerous to me than sitting at your kitchen table and having a bottle explode around you and your family. Now, I'm not trying to scare you, but it's something you should be aware of so you can prevent it. Using a hydrometer, you can know when your brew is finished and stable and therefore safe for bottling. We do cover this in another video. I just wanted to get that out there. Yes, you can calculate how much alcohol you made to using them. It's perfectly fine. The cylinder is to put the hydrometer in and product in for testing, and the wine thief, we use the master baster, is to take a sample from the fermenter. Okay. Some people prefer a refractometer, which does have the advantage of needing less product for testing, but the disadvantage is that they are vastly inaccurate once alcohol is present during fermentation, making them less useful than a simple, humble hydrometer, which costs about like $15. They're not that expensive. So it's like $15, say like $8 or $10, and this was like $6 or $7. So for like $20, you have the testing gear that you need, and as long as you don't break them, they don't call them hydrometers for nothing, you can use it for years and years and years. They don't go out of gauge or anything like that.
This is plastic. This is plastic.
Yeah.
This is glass.
Yep. Keep it in a plastic container. There are plastic hydrometers out there, and what I've heard, I've never used one, is that they are really inaccurate. Like sample to sample, they can be 20 points different, which is a huge amount of difference. Okay. We are homebrewers just like you guys, so we're all working on a little bit of a not so consistently accurate system because, I mean, you're reading little tiny lines and all this kind of stuff and then making calculations, but 20 points is still a lot. That, like, even with bad eyesight, you can still see a 20-point difference on a hydrometer. So it's a huge number. And if you start there, then you could be vastly inaccurate for other things. You could think that your brew is stalled, and there's a lot of problems that can come from it. And if you use two different hydrometers, it compounds the problem, because one could be 20 points too high, one could be 20 points too low, making for some very, very confusing readings. The next thing that you're going to want to have is an airlock. While not technically necessary, you probably want some method of keeping bugs and bacteria, hair, dirt, and dust out of your wine while it's brewing, right? An airlock is the best way. Cheesecloth is another. You can actually just cover it with cheesecloth, a rubber band or something, and that lets it breathe a little bit. That's a good thing for the first couple days. After that, it becomes less effective. You actually want an airlock, especially once you get to conditioning or secondary phase. I would avoid balloons due to them being not food safe, and they can pop off at the most inopportune of time, leading to accessibility to the aforementioned bugs. And I mean real bugs, and bacteria can get in. There are different kinds of airlocks. I actually really like the twin tube style airlock, but there's also the 3-piece airlock that works much the same way. The gases come out, they make it bubble, but nothing can go back in. It works kind of like the trap under your sink, okay? If you absolutely cannot get an airlock where you live, you can make them. There's lots of ways to do it. People have done it with pill bottles and all kinds of stuff. You can also make what's called a blow-off tube, which works really well. And for that, you just need your stopper that would go in the bottle. You stick some tubing into that, and you put the other end into a mason jar or other vessel filled with water. It does the exact same thing as these. It's a little less convenient to have sitting around, but it does the exact same job. It's safer than a balloon. It's better than just leaving the cap a little bit loose, and it does actually do a better job if you have pets and children than cheesecloth. The next thing you're going to want is a method to siphon your product, okay? We use an auto siphon, which is really just a pump, right, that has some tubing connected to it. So it creates a siphon, and just, you can pump the liquid off of sediment, lees into a bottle, whatever you need to do.
The reason why we use an auto siphon rather than just a tube or just pouring from a pitcher is we're trying to limit the amount of oxygen integrated into our brew once fermentation is complete.
People are constantly trying to reinvent the wheel with various filters, pouring methods, gizmos, gadgets. The auto siphon is probably still the most practical, effective, and safe way to rack your brew. Now, racking. Racking is usually done to move a liquid from one vessel to another, either for bottling or to remove the yeast that collects during normal fermentation. So this is just a way to move from one vessel to another, usually leaving behind sediment, fruits, solids, all that sort of thing. Or when you're bottling, you're going to do this as well.
You can use your auto siphon for bottling, or you can go ahead, if you're really getting into this hobby, and get an attachment for your auto siphon that's called a bottling wand. That goes onto the end of your tube, and that assists with the bottling procedure.
If you absolutely cannot get an auto siphon, just using the tubing is actually effective as well. You just have to create a siphon some other way, usually by filling it with liquid. It's a little bit messy, but if you keep both ends submerged, put one here, put the other one lower, you can then release, and it will cause a siphon as well. Try to refrain from putting your mouth on the tubing, because we've worked really hard to keep all the microorganisms out of our brews. So putting your mouth directly onto something that's going to be in your brew just seems a little counterproductive to that. The next thing you'll need is another vessel about the same size as your fermenter for secondary or conditioning phase. Now, what I mean by that is you don't actually have to have two vessels to store your brew in. You can use the same fermenter, but you need something to move it into to get it off that lease. Then you clean out that vessel and then put it back in. Or make your life easy, just have two fermenters. So that way you can just move from this into conditioning phase and you're good to go. Roughly the same size as your main fermenter is good. A little bit smaller is even better, because you do have a little bit of trube loss, they call it in beer making, but it's also called lees in wine making. And you're always going to have just a little bit of loss at the bottom where the sediment, the yeast, and the proteins and other solids fall out of suspension. So you want to keep the headspace above it to a minimum in conditioning phase, so a slightly smaller vessel actually works really well. We use a closed mouth a lot of time that is like a 1.2 gallon, even though it says 1 gallon, for primary, which is what we showed you earlier, and then we'll use a wide mouth, which is closer to exactly 1 gallon. It's about 0.2 gallons less, so we can still keep a minimum of headspace in secondary, and that way we have the most product coming from us in primary. The next thing you're going to need is something to store your finished wine in once you're all done. And that can be reused wine bottles, liquor bottles, beer bottles, newly purchased bottles for this purpose. Well, in theory, you can use mason jars. A lot of people ask about this. They don't hold pressure well, and if there's any pressure at all, they can burst. Now, pressure can come from fermentation isn't finished, or they're still off-gassing because CO2 is produced. Some people think that that makes it sparkling. That's not really the best way, but that's a whole other video. But not removing that before you bottle can cause pressure buildup over time. And in mason jars, they're not made for that. They're actually made for pressure while you're canning, but not for pressure out. So pressure against the jar collapsing, they can hold, but going out, they will explode pretty easily. They also don't pour very well. I'm noticing that with making our nut milks and things like that. It's a pain. They spill all over the place, so you make a mess.
Our two favorite styles of bottles, regardless of what size, are the screw top and the swing top. This happens to be a repurposed, I think it was whiskey, probably.
Probably whiskey.
So we just made sure that we cleaned it really good and we sanitized it, and now it's ready for its new beverage of choice.
Now, I would never put a carbonated beverage in that bottle because it didn't hold carbonation before. That's key. If it held carbonation before, the bottle is probably just fine to put a carbonated beverage in. But a stilled wine can go in there no problem.
And that leads us to the swing top. Swing tops are specifically designed typically for beer. This one is actually marketed for kombucha, but both of those are carbonated beverages. That means that the glass is tempered enough to be rated for a carbonated beverage, and the mechanism, the swing top, has this gasket that if pressure builds up, it will fail, releasing the gas and not exploding your bottle.
Hopefully. Don't depend on that. I've heard from some people that they still had swing tops explode, but it is kind of a nice backup fail-safe, okay, where that seal will hopefully give out before the glass does.
I think if we had to pick one out of the two of these, it would be the swing top, because these will last you forever, and this rubber gasket just pops right off, and it's replaceable. So you're good to go.
You can get hundreds of them on Amazon, super cheap. So that way the bottles, you'll have them for years and years and years and years. We just reuse them all the time. That's the trick. If you're going to give away your wines to friends and family, tell them, I want my bottles back. If they like your wines, they'll have no problem saving you bottles in expectation that they'll get another refilled bottle. Okay, so now you have a basic idea of what wine is. You have a basic idea of the gear that you might need. And if you're curious about prices, some of the fermentation vessels, if you look in your local grocery store, you might be able to find like apple cider and other juices in that 1 gallon container already. So I like to say that you're getting the juice for free as you buy the fermenter. The fermenters are anywhere from $10 to $20 if you buy them online or in a homebrew store. I've found that juice to be like $12 at our local Publix, and it comes with a gallon of free apple juice. So you're already set, and it's already sanitized in there, so you don't have to sanitize your fermenter. That's a way to get fermenters. So you probably want 2 of those. So let's call that, 10 to 20 bucks. So you're at anywhere from $20 to $40. When you get into the other aspects, you need the hydrometer. That's about 20 bucks. You want the auto siphon. They run about $15. So you're maximum already at about $75, right? And then yeast is cheap, $1 a packet or so. If you chose to go making mead, honey tends to get expensive. If you use juices, though, juices are fairly cheap. The bottles, you can spend anything you want on bottles or just reuse bottles you already have. So you're looking at anywhere from a $50 to $100 investment into making wine. Now, here's the thing. You're going to use most of that stuff over and over and over and over and over again. You can skip the initial fermenter cost by using bottled juices. So that could drop that 50 to 100 down to like $25 or $30 just to try it out and make sure you like it. If you watch our winemaking video, we did a very simple winemaking video. We talked about that if you've never made wine and you want to try it, you can actually walk through the aisles of your local grocery store, buy all the ingredients, and try it out for I think it was like $20 or less. So it's really, really inexpensive. And that's for a half gallon. That's like 2 to 3 bottles of wine. So it's actually a pretty decent amount.
So I know we've probably thrown out lots of terminology that's probably confusing you. So we're going to go through the really basics of the process of making wine right now.
Now, this is just an outline of how to make wine. This is not necessarily a recipe. So this is just to give you an idea of the steps involved to see if this is something you want to get into, not really an exact how-to. We have videos for that. Step 1, Sanitize your equipment, the fermenters, hydrometer, everything that will contact the wine. You want to have basically a tub of sanitization liquid. Wash your hands real good. Everything that touches that wine, you just want to be as clean as possible, okay? Number 2, add juice to your fermenter. Kind of goes without saying. Number 3, add more sugar if the recipe calls for it. Not all recipes do. Sometimes just the juice from the fruits is enough. Number 4, mix well and take a specific gravity reading. Again, optional technically, but it tells you where you started so you know if your brew has stalled, finished, and you can calculate how much ABV you have. Number 5, add yeast and mix again. Again, that's only if you're using a commercial yeast, which we do recommend in the beginning so that you can get more consistent results. Number 6, put on a lid and airlock. I highly recommend the airlock. I can't say that enough. Number 7, place your wine out of direct sunlight in a relatively consistent room temperatured location. This is important. Direct sunlight will possibly kill your yeast, and it could cause off flavors, so you definitely want that. You want the temperature to maintain within a few degrees of the same, so you don't want to put it someplace like right next to a heater or right next to an open window, or in the wintertime you don't want it right next to your front door where it's going to get cold air blasted at it and then get warm and all that. You want it to stay relatively the same. Ours stays anywhere from 72 to 76 or 77 degrees Fahrenheit pretty much 24/7. We tend to keep them in an area that doesn't get drafty either. That way, it's more or less consistent. Number 8, wait. Probably a few weeks depending on the recipe and conditions. We get people all the time that ask me if they can make wine in 3 days. Well, in theory, you can. It will not taste good and it will not be done, okay? Number 9, see number 8. In other words, keep waiting. There is no rush. There is no advantage to doing steps early, okay? If your wine's not finished, it's still not finished. Pushing it ahead is not helping. It's actually going to harm you in the long run. Number 10, test your gravity. What that means is take a reading when you think it looks like it might be slowing down. Like if the airlock activity is starting to really, really get slow, or it's neutraled out where it's even on both sides, that's when it's time to take a reading. And then you wait a week and take another reading. Notice I said wait a week. You want to make sure that it's not still fermenting. So if those readings are the same, it's finished and you can move on to the next step. That is, rack it to a new vessel. Why do we do that? Well, to get it off the lease and to give it some chance to age a bit more and start to settle out. This is called bulk aging or the conditioning phase. And this can last a week to several months depending on a lot of factors. I normally will just let it sit until it clears out. And 99.9% of the time, even without extra additives, chemicals, or clearing agents, they do all on their own. And you'll get more lease on the bottom. So you can rack again at that point, or you can bottle almost immediately. Then the next step is bottling. Put it into bottles for further storage. And bottle aging. Now this is optional, but most wines, ciders, meads, whatever, do get better in time. Even a month or 3 can vastly improve the quality of a homemade wine. And last, but certainly not least, the whole reason why you wanted to do this in the first place, number 16 is enjoy it. Drink it, share it with friends, give it away, whatever you'd like to do. We know a lot of people that make this stuff and don't even drink themselves. They use it as gifts, and it's probably one of the most unique gifts that you can give somebody because you can actually make a wine tailored to their specific taste and what they like, and they know it's something that you put thought and care into. Makes an incredible gift for people that actually appreciate wine. In summation, winemaking at home can be fun, rewarding hobby that brings us back to a time when everyone made wine in their kitchen rather than purchasing it. Making it yourself allows you to control the ingredients, know where it all came from, and know what you are putting into your body, making wine a potentially much more healthy food than the store-bought alternatives. If you like this video, look up. There's another video up there. You might like that one too.